Hi, everybody. Welcome to Special Education Thursday for April. My name is Molly Whalen, and I am a longtime parent advocate in special education in D.C., and I do Special Education Thursdays on behalf of Advocates for Justice in Education, which is the Parent Training and Information Center for D.C. for special education and for disabilities. And I'm really excited to do Special Education Thursday. We've now been doing them for a year and a couple of months. And we have a terrific library, and the idea around it is to take a bite-sized piece of some area of special education and talk about it with me as a parent, with an expert in the field, and hopefully provide a 20 to 30-minute session that just kind of gives us some basics and a better understanding of certain elements. And today we're going to be talking about the value of inclusion. And inclusion, if you have a child with special needs, you hear all the time, but a lot of people have a lot of different definitions of it. And I'm thrilled today to have Jennifer Halper, who is an attorney and a special education policy professional. And we're going to talk about why the law actually favors inclusion and a little bit about hopefully some of her philosophies and experience in working around special education and inclusion. So welcome, Jennifer. And the first thing I always love to ask every guest is, how did you get into this field? What's your background and why you do what you do?
Sure. Well, actually, when I got out of college, I went to work at the U.S. Department of Education and worked with some wonderful people there. And as I was leaving to go to law school, they made me promise that I would practice education law, that would be the only reason they would let me leave them. And so while I was in law school, I did focus mostly on education law, and I was lucky enough to be able to work in a law clinic and provide special education advocacy services to families in Baltimore City.
Great.
So that was my first experience with special education. And then after graduating from law school, I did a lot of work in New Jersey. I went to work for the Protection and Advocacy Organization in New Jersey and was there for 14 years practicing law up there. And then came back down to this area and worked for the Protection and Advocacy Organization in GC, University Legal Services. And so I've had a lot of experience working in different jurisdictions in special education and seeing how they handle that differently.
I don't think I realized how many different states you've worked in, which is fantastic. And so, in another session, we should talk about the way different states deal with special education. But since we're on inclusion, I'd love to know kind of what your definition of inclusion in schools, related to special education is. Like, how do you see it? How do you explain it to maybe a lay person?
Yeah, so inclusion is really having your students with disabilities interact with and have classes with typical peers. So that's really what inclusion is, having it modeled really after what the general community is. So most of the research indicates that between 12 to 15% of the population in the United States has a disability. So if you're really doing inclusion, you would have a classroom set up with those types of proportions.
Okay.
So you wouldn't want to see, if they're doing inclusion, having a class full of students with disabilities and at-risk kids.
Wow.
Okay. And some states and some jurisdictions do set it up that way. That's not really what inclusion is about.
That's an interesting piece to really think about, because so oftentimes when you see classrooms we're focused on DC for this, but, elsewhere, you have much higher than a 12 to 15% population of students with an IEP or a 504 or, as you said, at-risk kids. So that's interesting that that's still called inclusion when it's, really not maybe the model that you can make things work at.
Correct.
Yeah. And then how does it, I've got your slide about the history of inclusion and the Brown versus Board of Education and separate is inherently unequal. Tell me about what you want to say about this in regards to inclusion in special ed.
Sure. This is really the basis of where the disability movement came from. It really arose out of Brown versus Board of Education and having this idea that having segregated settings for people is not equal, that they are not receiving the same benefit and the same services. So as that whole civil rights movement kind of fleshed itself out, and in the 70s we really got to the disability movement, we had the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is the precursor to the IDEA. The thought was, yes, we agree that separate is not equal, but when we're talking about disability, we're really not talking the same thing as racial discrimination. It's similar in some ways, but students with disabilities are unique, and that we have to take that into account as well. So if you actually look at the law, the word inclusion, it doesn't exist in the law.
Oh, interesting.
It's not in the IDEA anywhere. So inclusion is really about your placement of where your program is offered. And the terminology that is used in the IDEA is the least restrictive environment, or as we shorten it to LRE. So the idea is that there is this continuum of placement options, realizing that there is some uniqueness when dealing with disability. That, yes, the preference is that you would be in your neighborhood school, but there may be some unique things about you and about your child's disability that might require a different setting. So there's no mandate that you have to attend your local school. It is about the uniqueness of the individual student and the uniqueness of their program that's in there.
So why do you feel like the federal law favors inclusion, right? Or I've always been told that, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I think, yes, there is an emphasis on that, but there's no mandate to it because of that uniqueness element. So that there is a way to get a different placement. And I would say that D.C. makes that a little more unique than in other jurisdictions as well because of the school choice options that are available to families as well. So as I say your neighborhood school, well, in D.C., it's slightly different. It's a little more nuanced because of the lottery system and the choices of schools that a parent has available to them. So the way I would kind of phrase that for DC is you go through that lottery process, and yes, ultimately the first placement in mind would be whatever you match up with in your lottery. So under the law, the thinking is the child should attend that school unless there's some unique reason why that's not possible. So you would go through your IEP process, and you would, talk about the goals and objectives, what services are needed for the child. Once you go through that entire process of developing the program for the student, that is when you should ask the question of where can this IEP be implemented?
Okay.
Can it be implemented in that lottery choice school or your home school environment and in the general classroom? And if it cannot be implemented there, that's when you would look for other placement options along the continuum.
Mm-hmm.
So
and one of the things that I think is challenging for DC, most of the DC public schools will say, when you ask them about special education, they will say we practice inclusion, and there's not a lot of other options other than maybe some standalone special education schools. I mean, wouldn't you feel that's kind of what people get stuck with around inclusion a lot?
Well, I think you get stuck with that, or you go into a school and they will say, well, we have this self-contained option. Your student has this disability, and then so we have this self-contained classroom. So for those who are listening, a self-contained classroom is not a general education environment. A self-contained classroom is a classroom that only has students with disabilities in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then why do you think that inclusion often fails for students, or sometimes fails? I feel like sometimes it feels like often, but maybe it's just sometimes. I mean, why doesn't it work for all? What's going on?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things at play. I think what most people don't realize is the amount of money and resources that are necessary to make an inclusive classroom successful. So you wouldn't have just your general education teacher in the classroom if you're trying to include a couple of special needs kids, so that you would have maybe a co-taught classroom, or you would have a related service provider. You have other adults who are embedded into that classroom to make it successful. Oftentimes, what I have seen when schools have tried to do inclusion is that they've tried to keep that same general ed model of having, your teacher in front of the classroom teaching to students at desks in front of them.
Yeah.
So you have one adult in the room with 30 to 35 children, and then on top of that, you're throwing in some students who might be experiencing some type of challenge. And so that is not a recipe for success.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good point, that inclusion is not just, it's so often said, inclusion is not just a seat in a class. It's not just putting the child into a classroom with non-disabled peers. You have to have supports and services, and that may be in the form of teachers or aides or related service providers, but it might also be in the form of assistive technology and, visual schedules and things like, movement breaks and all of those pieces to really make inclusion work. And all of those pieces often don't come along in some of our public schools, right?
I would say that's definitely true. I would say that in quite a few of the places that I've seen it trying to work, they're trying to take students and make them function in a typical general education environment instead of modifying that environment to meet the needs of the student that you are adding there.
Mhm. Mhm. What are some things? I know you've worked with parents a lot. What are some things that you tell parents when talking about inclusion, or just even the overall special education? What are things that you find yourself telling them a lot, or wish that you could tell all parents?
Yeah, I really talk a lot about how that IEP meeting should go, like how it should flow, and that you talk about placement last. What environment the student is going to learn in is what we discussed last. Because oftentimes, if you change that to the first topic of conversation, the services and the goals and objectives and everything else that goes into that IEP is going to be tailored around that environment you talked about first. So let's talk about the child first and the unique needs and what their strengths are, and build on those strengths. Let's not just focus on the weaknesses of the child. So talk about placement last and focus not solely on weaknesses, but focus on strengths, because you can build upon those strengths and you can add services around those strengths. Mm-hmm. So I talk about those two things a lot, and the third thing that I talk a lot about with parents is the actual disability, because that disability is unique for each child. So not every student with Down syndrome is the same. Not every child with autism is the same. That diagnosis affects each child individually. They're unique individuals, and so you don't want to just go and say, okay, this is the autism classroom. Everybody with autism gets put here. This is the cookie-cutter IEP for kids with autism. Mm-hmm. You don't want to do that with Down syndrome either. Like with any disability, because people are so different and so unique, those disabilities manifest themselves in different ways for each person. And so it's very important to look at the child as an individual and not just as a diagnosis.
Well, and that would really, the advice you gave to do that really is great. Is like, let's start at the IEP talking about the strengths of the child and what they need to succeed in a classroom. And then, as you said, leave the placement and the location of the classroom and what it looks like, for the end, so that you're really talking about that. And it gets to it. So I think that's a really great, philosophy with that. And do you have any, I know I asked you for some resources, and we've got a couple on the sites, but beyond, I'd love for you to talk about the two that you've listed, and then any others that you'd love to send parents to learn more.
Sure. I have listed on the slide there, rightslaw.com. Every parent that I work with, I send to this website. Mr. Wright is also an attorney, and he has developed wonderful resources on just about any topic of special education you can think of. He travels the country doing trainings for parents on IEP process, like everything under the sun. It's just a wealth of information. So if you're just getting started in this process, it's a good place to look. If you've been involved for quite a while and you're coming across a new topic, it's a great place to continue to go back on a regular basis. And he also has a blog where he talks about a lot of issues that he's seeing bubbling up at different points in time.
Oh, I didn't know about the blog. I have to sign up for that myself.
Yes. And he has books. I don't want to, really send people to spend money or whatever, but he does have books and trainings and the like. So he's a wealth of knowledge. He has a disability himself. He's argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court on special education cases. So I really see him as the preeminent expert in the country on special education. I know I go and refer to his stuff when I'm not sure of something, if I've come across a unique twist that I haven't dealt with in the past. The other resource I have listed there is University Legal Services. They're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. They're the protection and advocacy organization. So they provide free legal services to families in special education matters, among others. But with respect to special education, they have two priorities for which they take cases. And one would be inclusion, and the other is on secondary transition. So if you are a parent and you're struggling and you're trying to get an appropriate inclusive classroom environment for your students, you can always call there and look for some assistance, guidance, and perhaps legal representation.
Those are terrific. And we've got a few minutes. I'd love to ask you this question. Hopefully it's not too much of a ringer, but what is the thing that you feel is the best part of inclusion? Like what makes you want to advocate for inclusion? And then on the flip side, what's like the worst part? Like what's the thing that just makes you cringe, sometimes when you're talking inclusion or looking at things? So I'd love to hear some of your, thoughts on this, philosophies on this.
Yeah, so the thing that I really like about inclusion is that it helps not just students with disabilities, but it helps all students. And it really helps with this idea that we're all one community. And when students with disabilities leave school, they have to go out into the workforce. And who is going to be hiring them? The people that could end up hiring them could be the student that was sitting next to them in math class. Or, hey, I remember that kid. He was in my 6th grade class, and you know what? He may be a little quirky, but he's kind of cool too. I think, this might work. And it really brings us together. And I've seen that happen. And that it really helps to build those outcomes and that inclusiveness when students leave school. So that's what I really love seeing about inclusion. The stuff that really makes me cringe is when I see it being done wrong in classrooms, because you don't get that openness from students then, and it's not bringing what is intended. One, the student with disabilities, their needs aren't being met, and two, you don't have that openness from others in the classroom and that welcomeness that this is really, really a community.
Mhm. Yeah, and and I think that's I once heard, and maybe you'll like this quote or not, but I once heard that inclusion is one of the easiest things to do poorly, and when we do it poorly, everybody turns around and says, "See, it doesn't work." And I think some of your comments in talking about what does it really take, and it takes staffing, and it takes modifications, and it takes having resources in the classroom. And so I really appreciate you, kind of talking about that. And believe it or not, we're kind of close to 1 o'clock. But we've got a few minutes. Is there any last words, Jennifer, before we, do some of our ending points?
I just don't want to discourage anybody from pursuing inclusion if that's what they're looking for. It can work. It can work really well. Just as a parent or caregiver, it's going to take you staying on top of things and really looking to see what's being provided and what's being offered. So it really is like a whole community effort here. Trying to get it to work the way that it's supposed to work, because when it's done right, it's incredible. But like you said, when it's done wrong, it can be pretty bad.
Yeah, and I think it's a great emphasis to end with, that it has to be teamwork. It is not just a one teacher leading a classroom. That's not the definition of inclusion, and it takes a lot of people doing it. And as you said, and this is one of the reasons we do Special Education Thursdays, is really giving parents the invitation and the right and the resources to be very active and engaged in this process and really advocating for their child. So I thank you very much. Hopefully this was pretty painless for you. Everybody, we will be doing our next Special Education Thursday on May 3rd, and that topic is going to be a little heavier, but it's going to be about what DC parents need to know about restraint and seclusion going on in the classroom and in schools. And as I said, it might be a little heavier of a topic, but it's definitely important for parents to know about that issue and what they can do and what their rights are. So thank you very much, Jennifer. Everybody, the recordings will be on the website within the next day or two, and you can always go to AJE's website and look for webinars, and you will find a whole library of all of our topics of Special Education Thursday. And we've really had a terrific, about 20 plus different guests coming on and talking. So thank you very much, Jennifer. I am going to stop the recording, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.